The candles trembled as if resisting an invisible wind. She stood at the altar in white, fingers rigid, heart suspended between humiliation and the strange dignity of those who learn too early the price of appearance. The murmur of silken shame filled the hall. He stepped back, the ring in his trembling hands, and whispered the refusal that would break her life in two. Before we dive into this story, leave your rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're watching from. May this moment reach your heart. The candles burned with a resistance that seemed almost human, their flames bending against a wind that did not exist. In the great hall of the northern chapel, voices tangled with the rustle of silk and the creak of ancient wood. But beneath it all lay a silence that was not born of reverence. It was the silence of scandal held in check, of breath drawn and held, of eyes that watched and judged and waited for the inevitable fall. She stood at the altar in white. Though the colour felt less like purity and more like surrender, her name was Isola, and she had no memory of choosing this dress, this moment, this fate. The daughter of a house that had crumbled slowly over decades. She had been raised in corridors that smelled of beeswax and disappointment, taught to walk softly and speak less, to make herself small enough that the world might overlook her lack of fortune. Her father had died owing more than he owned. Her mother had followed him within the year, as if pulled by the same tide of debt and despair. What remained was a girl with fine features and empty coffers, a burden passed between distant relatives until someone decided she might be useful after all. The man she was meant to marry stood beside her now, though he had not looked at her once since the ceremony began. His name was Edric, heir to lands that sprawled across 3 provinces and debts that sprawled even further. He was pale and soft-handed, the kind of man who had never worked for anything and thus valued nothing, whose greatest fear was the opinion of those who mattered and whose greatest cruelty was born of that same cowardice. She had met him twice before this day. Once at the signing of the contract, where he had stared past her shoulder as if she were furniture. Once at a dinner where he had spoken only to the men on either side of him, dismissing her presence with the efficiency of long practice. Now, as the priest intoned words older than the stones beneath their feet, Edric's hands trembled. The ring he held caught the light, a circle of gold that felt more like a shackle. Isola kept her eyes down, her breathing measured, her mind somewhere far from this place. She had learned early that escape was not always physical. Sometimes it was simply the art of removing yourself from the moment, of letting your body stand in place while your thoughts wandered elsewhere. She thought of the sea, which she had seen only once as a child. She thought of the way the water had moved, vast and indifferent, swallowing everything without judgment. The priest paused. It was a small pause, barely noticeable, but Isola felt it like a stone dropped into still water. She lifted her eyes just enough to see Edric's face, and what she saw there made something cold settle in her chest. He was staring at the ring as if it had become a living thing, as if the weight of it might drag him down into the earth. His lips moved, shaping words that did not come. The congregation shifted, a collective intake of breath that sounded like wind through reeds. "I cannot," Edric said. The words fell like a blade on marble, sharp and final. The ring slipped from his fingers, clattering against the stone floor with a sound that seemed to echo forever. Isola did not move. She could not move. Her body had become a statue, every muscle locked in place, every nerve screaming silently beneath skin that suddenly felt too thin to contain her. The veil covered her face, but it could not hide the way her breath caught, the way her lips trembled despite her desperate attempt at control. Around them, the hall erupted in whispers. The women leaned toward each other, their voices a viscous murmur of false compassion and genuine delight. The men looked away, feigning piety to mask the cruel pleasure they took in witnessing someone else's fall. The priest stood frozen, his book still open, his mouth moving soundlessly as if he had forgotten the language of comfort. And Isola remained at the altar, alone in a way that felt more profound than any loneliness she had known before. This was the moment her life split in two. There was the before when she had been merely poor, merely unfortunate, merely invisible. And there was the after, which was forming around her now like ice on a winter pond. She would be the girl abandoned at the altar. The girl no one wanted. The The girl whose humiliation would be whispered about in drawing rooms and ballrooms, embellished with each retelling until the truth of her became inseparable from the fiction of her disgrace. She felt her hands begin to shake and forced them still. She felt tears pressing against the back of her eyes and refused to let them fall. If this was to be her ruin, she would meet it standing upright. If this was to be the story they told about her, she would give them no more ammunition. Let them see her silent. Let them see her still. Let them wonder what she felt behind the veil, behind the white dress, behind the locked door of her expression. The seconds stretched. Edric had already stepped back, already turned away, already begun the process of erasing her from his life. The guests were already rising, already gathering their things, already preparing to leave and spread the news. The priest was already closing his book, already preparing words of apology that would mean nothing. And Isola was already learning what it meant to be a spectacle, to be the subject of a story she had no part in writing. Then the doors opened. They did not open slowly or tentatively. They opened with force as if struck by a hand that did not ask permission. The sound of wood against stone rang through the hall like a bell, and the wind that followed carried with it the smell of pine and rain and something darker, something that tasted of iron and ash. Half the candles gutted themselves, their flames surrendering to the sudden gust. The chandeliers swayed, their crystals singing a high, thin note that made the hairs on Isola's arms stand upright. The murmuring stopped. Every head turned, every eye fixed on the doorway, where a figure stood framed by the fading light of afternoon. For a moment no one moved. For a moment the world held its breath. He entered without hurry, his movements fluid and deliberate, each step placed with the precision of someone who has never needed to rush, because time has always bent to his will rather than the reverse. He wore black, not the fashionable black of morning or evening wear, but something older, something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His cloak moved around him like smoke, like shadow given weight and form. His face was angular and pale, beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful, carved from something harder than flesh. Isola had heard of him, though the stories varied depending on who told them. Some called him the Duke of the North, lord of territories so remote that maps drew them in with uncertain lines. Others called him the Shadow Lord, claiming he did not sleep, did not age, did not follow the rules that governed ordinary men. There were whispers of old blood, of lineages that reached back before kingdoms had names, of powers that belonged more to myth than to the modern world. His name was Lucien, though few spoke it aloud, as if the sound of it carried weight. He moved through the hall like water through stone, inevitable and unhurried. People stepped back without realizing they were moving, creating a path that led straight to the altar. The priest pressed himself against the pulpit, his face colorless. Edric stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to put distance between himself and the approaching figure. And Isola stood frozen, her hands still clasped in front of her, her veil still covering her face, her entire being focused on the sound of footsteps that were somehow both loud and silent at once. Lucien stopped in front of her. Up close, he was taller than she had expected, his presence filling the space between them until it felt like there was no air left to breathe. His eyes found hers through the veil, and she felt the impact of that gaze like a physical thing, like being seen for the first time in her life. They were grey, those eyes, the colour of steel and storms, and they held an intelligence that felt ancient and unnerving. "Now she is mine," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried through the hall as if the stones themselves had chosen to amplify it. It was a voice that expected to be obeyed, that had never learned the language of request because it had only ever needed to command. The words settled over the congregation like a verdict, like a sentence handed down from a court that did not allow appeals. No one laughed, no one protested. The power in that voice, in that presence, made dissent unthinkable. The priest bowed his head as if in prayer or surrender. Edric took another step back, his face now completely drained of colour, his hands shaking so badly that he had to clasp them together to still them. The guests sat frozen in their pews, their earlier excitement curdled into something that tasted of fear. Isola felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt the blood rushing in her ears, felt everything in her that had been held in check suddenly strain against invisible bonds. She should speak. She should refuse. She should do something other than stand here like a doll waiting to be claimed. But her voice had abandoned her, and her body had become something separate from her will. And all she could do was stand there as Lucienne reached forward and lifted the veil from her face. The light hit her eyes, too bright after the translucent barrier of lace. She blinked, and when her vision cleared, she found him still watching her, his expression unreadable. There was something in his gaze that was not cruelty, not kindness, but something else entirely. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation, or something so foreign to her experience that she had no name for it. He extended his hand. It was not a request. It was an inevitability. She took it. His fingers closed around hers, cool and firm, and she felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. Later, she would wonder what possessed her to accept, what broke through the paralysis that had held her since Edric's refusal. Perhaps it was the understanding that she had nothing left to lose. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of being something to be rejected. Perhaps it was simply that his certainty felt safer than her own uncertainty. Whatever the reason, she placed her hand in his and let him lead her away from the altar, away from the gasping congregation, away from the life that had just ended without her permission. They walked through the hall in silence. The guests remained seated, their eyes following but their bodies immobile, as if they had all been turned to salt. The great doors stood open behind them, revealing a courtyard where twilight had begun to settle, painting everything in shades of blue and silver. A carriage waited, black and unmarked, its horses standing unnaturally still. Lucian handed her up into the interior without a word, then followed, the door closing behind them with a soft click that sounded final. As the carriage began to move, Isola looked back once through the small window. The chapel was already receding into the distance, its lights growing smaller, its significance shrinking with each turn of the wheels. She could see figures emerging from the doors now, could imagine the explosion of voices that must be filling the hall, the theories and accusations and wild speculation that would spin her abandonment into something even more dramatic than the reality. But their voices could not reach her here, and their judgment could not touch her in this space that smelled of leather and something else, something faintly metallic and cold. She turned to face forward and found Lucian watching her from the opposite seat. He had not spoken since they left the chapel. His face remained impassive, but there was an intensity to his attention that made her feel exposed, despite being fully clothed. She pulled her hands into her lap, folding them carefully, trying to find some anchor in the storm of confusion and fear and strange relief that churned through her. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Home," he replied, and offered nothing more. The castle rose from the hills like something grown rather than built, its towers reaching toward a sky heavy with clouds. They arrived as full darkness fell, and Isola had only impressions: stone walls that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, narrow windows that glowed with warm illumination, gates that opened without sound. The air here tasted different, cleaner and sharper, scented with pine and the promise of rain. Servants appeared as they entered, silent figures who moved with the fluid efficiency of long practice. They did not look directly at her, but she felt their curiosity like a weight. A woman with silver hair and a severe expression stepped forward, curtsying briefly before gesturing for Isola to follow. Lucien had already disappeared into another corridor, his cloak trailing behind him like liquid darkness. She hesitated, but there was nowhere else to go. No other choice to make, so she followed the woman through passages that seemed to twist and turn with no clear logic. The room they led her to was beautiful in an austere way. A bed with dark curtains, a fireplace where flames already danced, windows that overlooked nothing but night and the suggestion of forest beyond. The woman helped her out of the wedding dress without speaking, her hands quick and impersonal, then dressed her in a nightgown of soft white linen. Isola submitted to this care numbly, her mind still trying to catch up with everything that had happened. When the woman finally left, Isola found herself alone for the first time since morning. She walked to the window and pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Outside, the wind moved through invisible trees, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. She thought about the chapel, about Edric's pale face, about the gasps and whispers. She thought about Lucien's hand closing around hers, about the certainty in his voice when he claimed her. She thought about the fact that she was no longer Isola the abandoned, Isola the rejected, Isola the humiliated. Now she was something else entirely, though she did not yet know what. Sleep came eventually, pulling her under despite her racing thoughts. She dreamed of candles that burned backward, of veils that covered the world rather than her face, of a voice that spoke her name in a language she had never learned but somehow understood. When she woke, morning light filtered through the windows, pale and uncertain. Someone had brought breakfast while she slept, leaving it on a small table near the fire. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing, her mind already circling around the question of what came next. The days that followed established a strange rhythm. She was given freedom to explore the castle, though certain doors remained locked and certain corridors felt unwelcoming. She discovered a library with books in languages she did not recognize, a conservatory where plants grew in impossible profusion despite the northern climate, a gallery lined with portraits of people who all shared the same unsettling gaze. The servants attended to her needs but did not speak unless spoken to, and even then their answers were brief and carefully neutral. Lucien himself remained largely absent. She would catch glimpses of him in distant corridors, hear his voice behind closed doors, sense his presence in the way the servants moved and the way the atmosphere shifted. But he did not seek her out, did not explain, did not demand anything of her. It was as if he had claimed her and then forgotten her, leaving her in a liminal space between captivity and freedom, between guest and prisoner. On the fifth day, a delegation arrived from the capital. Isola watched from an upper window as carriages rolled through the gates, disgorging nobles in rich clothes and grave expressions. She recognized some of them from the wedding, including the pale form of Edric, who looked even more diminished here than he had in the chapel. They were ushered into the great hall, and though Isola could not hear their words, she could imagine their purpose. They had come to demand explanations, to assert authority, to reclaim control over a situation that had slipped from their grasp. That evening, she was summoned to the hall herself. The silver-haired woman came to her room with a dress of deep crimson, helping her into it with the same silent efficiency. Isola descended the stairs with her heart pounding, uncertain what role she was meant to play in whatever drama was unfolding. The hall was full of people, their faces turned toward her as she entered. At the far end, Lucien sat in a chair that looked less like furniture and more like a throne, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. She walked the length of the hall, aware of every eye on her, every whisper that followed in her wake. When she reached the front, Lucien gestured to a chair beside him. She sat, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight. She could feel the weight of judgment from the assembled nobles, could hear the undertone of outrage in their muttered conversations. They thought she was complicit in this somehow. They thought she had orchestrated her own rescue, had planned this scandal, had used some feminine wile to ensnare a powerful man. One of the nobles stepped forward, a man with greying hair and an expression of practiced authority. "My Lord Duke," he began, his voice carrying the careful courtesy that barely concealed contempt. "We have come to discuss the matter of this young woman. Her betrothed has filed a formal complaint, claiming that she was taken from him unlawfully. There are questions of propriety, of honor, of—" "She belongs to me," Lucien interrupted, his voice cutting through the man's speech like a knife through silk. "Therefore she is beyond your judgment." The hall erupted in protest. Voices rose, some angry, some scandalized, all of them united in their refusal to accept such a simple dismissal. Isola sat very still, her hands clenched together now, her breathing shallow. She felt like a bone being fought over by dogs, except she was expected to sit silent and dignified throughout the entire process. Edric stood, his face flushed with what might have been courage, or simply the bravado of someone who felt the crowd on his side. "She was promised to me," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "The contracts were signed. The ceremony was begun. You had no right—" "I had every right," Lucien said, and something in his tone made Edric fall silent mid-sentence. You surrendered your claim when you refused to honor it. What was abandoned is free to be claimed by those with the courage to do so. Or would you argue otherwise? The challenge hung in the air like a blade. Edric opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. But no words came. He had no defense, no argument that would not make him look even more cowardly than he already did. He sat down heavily, his face now pale rather than flushed, his hands trembling in his lap. The grey-haired noble tried again. Even so, my lord, there are customs, traditions. Customs change, Lucien said. Traditions adapt. What does not adapt dies. She remains here, under my protection, and anyone who wishes to dispute that is welcome to do so directly. His eyes swept the room, and Isola felt the temperature drop several degrees. Anyone? No one spoke. No one moved. The power radiating from him was not physical, but somehow more real than physicality, a force that pressed against the lungs and made the heart stutter. These were men and women used to power, used to wielding it and bending others to their will. But here, in this place, their authority meant nothing. Here, they were the supplicants, and he was the arbiter of their fates. One by one, they bowed their heads. One by one, they murmured their acquiescence. Even Edric, when his turn came, managed a shaky nod that might have been agreement or simply defeat. The meeting dissolved soon after, the nobles retreating to their carriages with whatever dignity they could salvage, leaving behind a wake of whispered conversations and sideways glances. When they were gone, Isola remained in her chair, her hands still folded, her heart still racing. Lucien stood, moving toward one of the tall windows that overlooked the courtyard. She watched him go, uncertain whether she had been dismissed or was expected to follow. After a moment, she stood as well, her legs unsteady beneath her. "Why?" she asked, the word escaping before she could think better of it. He did not turn. "Why what? Why did you claim me? Why did you bring me here? Why are you protecting me? From them?" The questions tumbled out, each one carrying the weight of days of silence and confusion. "Because no one else had the courage to do so," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Because I do not tolerate waste, and you were being wasted. Because the sight of you standing at that altar, abandoned and alone, offended something in me that I did not know could still be offended." She moved closer, drawn by the unexpected honesty in his words. "And what am I to you now?" He turned then, his grey eyes finding hers. That remains to be seen. The bell in the distant village began to toll, its sound carrying through the open window. Isola counted the strikes without thinking, a habit from childhood. 7, the hour of evening prayers. Though she could not remember the last time she had prayed, she wondered if anyone was praying for the noble who had mocked Lucien during the meeting, the one who had laughed too loudly at Edric's complaint. They said he had fallen ill on the journey home, that his carriage had to stop several times, that by the time they reached the city, he was burning with fever. They said it was sudden, unexpected, that the physicians could find no cause. Isola did not ask about it. She had learned in her short time here that some questions were better left unspoken. Instead, she watched the smoke rising from the distant chimneys and tried to understand what her life had become. The castle settled into evening around her. Servants lit candles, prepared meals, went about their duties with the same silent efficiency. Lucien returned to whatever business occupied him behind closed doors, and Isola retreated to her room, where she sat by the window and watched the stars emerge one by one, each point of light a question without an answer. She thought about the chapel, about the moment before the doors opened. She thought about the girl she had been, standing in white and shame, believing that her life had already reached its end. She thought about how wrong she had been, how that moment of absolute humiliation had somehow become the doorway to something else entirely. She did not know yet, if this new thing was better or worse than what she had lost. She knew only that she was here, alive, no longer invisible, no longer nothing. In the darkness beyond her window, an owl called. She listened to its voice, haunting and clear, and felt something in her chest loosen slightly. Tomorrow would come, and the day after that, and all the days that followed. She would learn the rules of this place, the rhythms of this life. She would discover what it meant to be claimed by someone who commanded shadows and bent time to his will. For now, though, she simply sat and breathed and felt the strange relief of no longer being abandoned, of being, for the first time she could remember, chosen. Even if she did not fully understand why, even if the choosing felt more like a chess move than an act of affection, it was still more than she had ever expected to receive. The candle on her bedside table burned down to a stub, then went out. In the darkness, Isola finally lay down, pulling the covers up to her chin. Sleep came more easily than it had the previous nights, pulling her under with gentle insistence. She dreamed of flight, of wings that carried her above the forest and the castle and the distant city, high enough that everything below became small and manageable, and somehow less frightening than it had seemed from ground level. When morning came again, she woke with a sense of purpose she had not felt before. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple gown of dark blue from the wardrobe that had appeared in her room. She braided her hair herself, refusing the help of the servants who waited outside her door. She ate breakfast slowly, tasting each bite, reminding herself that she was allowed to exist, allowed to take up space, allowed to want things. Then she set out to explore the parts of the castle she had not yet seen. She moved through corridors with more confidence, opening doors that had seemed forbidding before. She discovered a music room with instruments she did not know how to play but touched anyway, drawing discordant notes that somehow felt appropriate. She found a tower room filled with maps and charts, showing territories and borders that did not match any geography she recognized. She climbed stairs that spiraled upward into shadows, following them until they ended at a door that was locked with something more than a simple bolt. She stood before that door for a long time, her hand resting on the wood, feeling the way it thrummed with something she could not name. Then she turned and descended, making her way back to the more familiar parts of the castle, where light and warmth and the smell of cooking food reminded her that she was still human, still bound by ordinary needs and desires. That afternoon, she encountered Lucien in the library. He sat at a large desk surrounded by papers and books, his expression focused in a way that made him look somehow more approachable than his usual remote demeanor. She hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt or retreat. He looked up before she could decide, his grey eyes finding hers with that unsettling directness that seemed to see through skin and bone to whatever lay beneath. "Come in," he said, gesturing to a chair near the desk. She entered slowly, taking the offered seat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it was charged with something, a potential energy that made the air feel heavier. Outside the window, clouds gathered, promising rain. "You were in the North Tower," he said, not a question but a statement. "How did you know?" "The castle tells me things," he replied, and there was the faintest hint of amusement in his expression. "Or perhaps the servants do. Either way, very little happens here that I do not know about." "I did not open the door," she said, feeling suddenly defensive. "I know. If you had, we would be having a different conversation." He set down his pen, leaning back in his chair. "You are curious. That is good. Curiosity means you are becoming comfortable here." "I do not know if comfortable is the right word," she admitted. "I feel like I am waiting for something, but I do not know what." "For the other shoe to drop," he said, "for the price to be revealed, for the bargain to show its teeth." She nodded, surprised that he understood so clearly. "Yes, exactly that." "There is no price," he said. "Or rather, the price has already been paid. I claimed you. You accepted. That is the entirety of the transaction. But why? The question burst from her before she could stop it. You keep saying you do not tolerate waste, that you were offended by my abandonment. But those are not reasons, not really. There must be something more. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood, moving to the window to look out at the gathering storm. "When I was young," he said, his voice softer than she had heard it before, "I was given a choice, power or humanity. One could not coexist with the other, or so I was told. I chose power, and for a very long time, I believed I had made the right choice. Power protects, power endures, power does not disappoint or betray." He paused, his hand resting on the window frame. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, spattering against the glass like tears. "But power also isolates," he continued. "It builds walls that nothing can penetrate. And after centuries of those walls, I had forgotten what it felt like to see someone vulnerable and want to protect them not because they were mine, but because they were human and fragile and deserving of protection simply by virtue of existing." Isola sat very still, barely breathing, afraid that any sound might break the spell of this confession. Lucien turned to face her, and for the first time since she had met him, his expression was not remote or commanding, but something closer to human. "When I saw you at that altar," he said, "I saw someone who refused to break despite every reason to do so. I saw strength disguised as surrender, dignity wrapped in humiliation. And I thought, here is someone who knows the cost of surviving. Here is someone who has learned to endure. That is rarer than you might think, and infinitely more valuable than beauty or wealth or any of the things those people in that chapel valued." The rain intensified, drumming against the windows with increasing force. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and ominous. Isola felt something shift inside her, some barrier she had not known existed crumbling under the weight of his words. She had spent her entire life being told she was worthless, being shown through action and inaction that she did not matter. And now this man, this impossibly powerful and strange man, was telling her that he had seen value in her precisely at the moment when she had felt most valueless. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "You do not need to say anything," he replied. "I do not require gratitude or devotion or any of the things you might think you owe me. I simply require that you exist here without fear, that you learn to take up space as if you have a right to it, that you remember that being chosen is not the same as being owned." She stood then, her legs steadying beneath her, and crossed to where he stood by the window. They looked out at the storm together, watching as the sky opened and the rain poured down in sheets that turned the world beyond the glass into a blur of grey and green. She could feel the heat of his presence beside her, could sense the barely contained power that seemed to pulse just beneath his skin. But for the first time, she did not find it frightening. She found it almost comforting, like standing next to a fire on a cold night. "Thank you," she said. The words simple but weighted with everything she could not articulate. "You are welcome," he replied, and for a moment his hand brushed against hers. A contact so brief it might have been accidental but felt deliberate all the same. The storm raged through the afternoon and into evening, rattling the windows and howling through the corridors. Isola spent the rest of the day in the library, reading books whose titles she could not pronounce, occasionally glancing up to find Lucien still at his desk, still working through his papers with that intense focus. They did not speak again, but the silence between them had changed, had become something companionable rather than tense. When dinner was served, they ate together in a small dining room that overlooked the rain-soaked gardens. The food was simple but well prepared, and Isola found herself eating with genuine appetite for the first time since her arrival. They talked of small things, the books in the library, the history of the castle, the peculiarities of northern weather. It was the kind of conversation that might happen between strangers learning to become acquaintances, tentative but genuine. After dinner, Lucien walked her to her room, a gesture that felt both courtly and protective. At her door, he paused, his hand resting on the frame in a posture that mirrored his earlier stance at the library window. "Sleep well," he said. "And you?" she replied. He smiled then, a small expression that transformed his face into something almost boyish. Then he turned and disappeared down the corridor, his footsteps silent on the stone floor. Isola entered her room and closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment as she tried to process everything that had happened that day. The storm continued through the night, but inside her room she felt safe and warm. She changed into her nightgown and climbed into bed, pulling the covers up and listening to the rain's rhythm against the window. She thought about what Lucian had said in the library, about choosing power over humanity, about seeing value in her brokenness. She thought about the way his hand had brushed against hers, the smile that had softened his features. She thought about the fact that she was no longer afraid of him, no longer uncertain about whether this place could become a home. Sleep claimed her gently, and her dreams were different this time. She dreamed of the castle in sunlight, of walking through gardens where flowers bloomed in impossible colours. She dreamed of music that filled empty rooms, of laughter that echoed through silent corridors. She dreamed of hands reaching for each other across distances both vast and infinitesimal, of connections forming slowly but surely, like roots growing deep beneath the earth. When she woke the next morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through her windows, painting everything in shades of gold. She rose and dressed, then made her way downstairs, drawn by the smell of fresh bread and the sound of voices in the kitchen. The servants greeted her with something approaching warmth, offering her breakfast and asking if she needed anything. She accepted their offerings gratefully, then took her plate to the conservatory, where she could sit among the green, growing things and feel the sun on her face. She was there when Lucien found her, sometime near midday. He entered quietly, his presence announced only by the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. She looked up from the book she had been reading, a treatise on some obscure form of botany, and smiled. "Good morning," she said. "Good afternoon," he corrected gently, returning her smile. "You have been here for some time." "It is peaceful," she said. "I like the way the light comes through the glass. It makes everything feel alive." He moved to stand beside her, looking down at the plants that crowded every surface. "These were planted by someone I knew a long time ago," he said. She believed that life should be cultivated even in the darkest places, that beauty could exist anywhere if you were willing to nurture it. "She sounds wise," Isola said. "She was," he agreed, a note of old sadness colouring his voice. "She taught me many things before she died. I keep this place as a memorial to those lessons." Isola set aside her book and stood, moving closer to examine a particularly striking flower, its petals the colour of deep wine. "Did you love her?" she asked, the question escaping before she could consider whether it was appropriate. "In a way," he said. "Not romantically, but deeply nonetheless. She was a friend when I had very few, a voice of reason when power threatened to make me unreasonable. Her loss was difficult." "I am sorry," Isola said, meaning it. "It was long ago," he replied. "But I appreciate your sympathy. It is rare to find someone who understands that grief does not follow a convenient timeline, that losses can ache across centuries as easily as across days." They stood together among the plants, surrounded by green life and filtered sunlight, and Isola felt something settling inside her, something like peace or perhaps acceptance. She had come to this place broken and discarded, had expected nothing and received everything. Now, standing here with this strange man who had claimed her without explanation and protected her without demand, she felt the first stirrings of something that might eventually become belonging. The days that followed established a new rhythm. Isola explored the castle with increasing freedom, discovering rooms and passages she had not known existed. She found a music room where she taught herself to play simple melodies on a piano that seemed to tune itself. She found a studio filled with paints and canvases, and though she had no training, she began to experiment with colour and form, creating abstracts that captured the emotions she could not always put into words. She found a garden that bloomed year-round despite the northern climate, where she could walk among roses and lilies and flowers she had no names for. Lucien gave her space but was not absent. They took meals together, shared evenings in the library, occasionally walked the grounds when weather permitted. They talked about everything and nothing: philosophy and history, music and art, the nature of power and the cost of isolation. Isola learned that he was far older than he appeared, that he had lived through the rise and fall of kingdoms, that he had accumulated knowledge and regrets in equal measure. She learned that beneath his austere exterior was someone who valued intelligence and honesty, who appreciated wit and could be surprisingly gentle when gentleness was needed. She told him things she had never told anyone. About her childhood in that cold house, about the succession of relatives who had taken her in out of obligation rather than affection, about the small cruelties that accumulated over time until she had learned to expect nothing better. He listened without judgment, without trying to fix or minimize her experiences, simply bearing witness to her pain in a way that made it feel less overwhelming. 3 weeks after her arrival, another delegation came to the castle. This time it was not nobles demanding explanations, but messengers carrying news. The king himself had issued a decree recognizing Lucien's claim, legitimizing Isola's presence in the castle, and effectively severing any remaining ties to Edric or her former life. The announcement had caused scandal in the capital, but the king's word was law, and those who opposed it could do little more than mutter in private. Isola received the news with mixed feelings. On one hand, it meant security, legitimacy, and end to uncertainty. On the other, it meant finality, a door closing on any possibility of return. Not that she wanted to return. The life she had left behind held nothing for her but bad memories and worse prospects. Still, there was something disorienting about having her fate decided by others, even when the decision worked in her favor. "How do you feel?" Lucien asked that evening, as they sat together in the library. "Strange," she admitted. "Relieved, I think, but also somewhat overwhelmed. It all happened so quickly. One day I was being abandoned at the altar, the next I am here, and now I am apparently under royal protection. It does not feel quite real." "Reality is often less solid than we imagine," he said. "We think of our lives as fixed narratives, but they are actually fluid things, constantly reshaping themselves in response to chance and choice. You have been changed by circumstance, yes, but you have also changed yourself through how you responded to it. You could have broken. You did not. That matters more than the decree of any king." She considered his words, turning them over in her mind. "You make it sound as if I had a choice." "You did," he insisted. "You always do. The choices might not be good ones, but they exist nonetheless. You chose to stand upright at that altar. You chose to take my hand. You chose to make a life here rather than simply exist in limbo. Those were not small choices, and they have shaped who you are becoming." "And who am I becoming?" she asked, genuinely curious. He smiled, that rare expression that softened his features. "Someone formidable, I think. Someone who knows her own strength even if she does not yet trust it. Someone worth knowing." The compliment warmed her more than she wanted to admit. She had spent so long being told she was worthless that praise felt foreign, almost suspicious. But she was learning to accept that Lucien did not speak idly, that his words carried weight precisely because he used them sparingly. If he said she was formidable, if he said she was worth knowing, then perhaps there was truth in it. As autumn deepened into the promise of winter, Isola found herself settling into castle life with unexpected ease. The servants had warmed too, her no longer treating her with suspicion but with something approaching affection. They taught her the rhythms of the household, showed her where things were kept, answered her questions about the castle's history. She learned that Lucien was a fair master, demanding but not cruel, that he protected those under his care with the same fierce certainty with which he had claimed her. She learned also that the castle was not entirely empty of guests. Occasionally, people would arrive seeking Lucien's counsel or assistance. Some were nobles with disputes they wanted arbitrated. Others were scholars seeking access to his extensive library. A few were supplicants with problems they believed only he could solve. Isola watched these interactions with interest, noting how Lucian's demeanor shifted depending on who he was dealing with. He could be stern or sympathetic, distant or engaged, always calibrating his response to what the situation required. Once, a young woman arrived claiming to be cursed, asking if Lucian could break the spell. He listened to her story with patience, then gently explained that what she called a curse was actually illness, treatable by physicians if she would trust their care. He sent her away with gold for treatment and a letter of introduction to a doctor he trusted. The woman left grateful but disappointed, having wanted magic when what she needed was medicine. "Do you get many like that?" Isola asked after the woman had gone. "More than you might think," Lucienne replied. "People want simple explanations for complex problems. They want villains they can identify and heroes who can save them. The truth is usually far more mundane and far more difficult to accept." "But you are not mundane," she pointed out. "The things people say about you are mostly exaggeration," he interrupted. "Yes, I am old. Yes, I have certain abilities that ordinary humans do not. But I am not a monster, despite what some believe, and I am not a savior, despite what others hope. I am simply someone who has learned to survive a very long time and who uses that survival to help when I can and protect what is mine." "And I am yours," she said. Not quite a question, but not quite a statement either. "You are under my protection," he corrected. "That is not the same as being possessed. You are free to leave if you wish. The gates are never locked." She had not known that. The realization shifted something in her understanding of her situation. She was not a prisoner. She could walk away at any time. That she chose not to, that she wanted to stay, suddenly felt significant in a way it had not before. "I do not wish to leave," she said quietly. "Good," he replied, and the word carried more weight than its simplicity suggested. Winter arrived, with sudden ferocity burying the grounds under snow and turning the forest into a landscape of white silence. The castle became a warm refuge, its fires burning bright, its windows glowing like eyes against the darkness. Isola spent her days reading, painting, learning to play the piano with increasing skill. She spent her evenings with Lucienne there, conversations ranging from the philosophical to the practical, punctuated by comfortable silences that felt as natural as speech. On the longest night of the year, the servants prepared a feast. The great hall was decorated with evergreen boughs and candles, the tables laden with food and wine. Lucienne invited everyone in the household to dine together, from the highest-ranking steward to the youngest kitchen maid. It was a tradition, he explained, that dated back centuries, a reminder that even in the darkest time of year, community and warmth could be found. Isola sat beside him at the head table, wearing a dress of deep green velvet that made her feel regal. She watched the servants laugh and talk among themselves, watched the way they relaxed in this rare moment of informality. She felt something like happiness blooming in her chest, fragile and new but unmistakable. "You look content," Lucienne observed, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "I am," she admitted. "I did not think I would ever feel this way again. Perhaps I never felt this way before. I am not sure which would be sadder." "Neither is sad," he said. "Both simply are. We cannot change the past, but we can shape the future. You are shaping yours right now, in this moment, by choosing to be present and allowing yourself to feel joy." She turned to look at him, this man who had saved her without being asked, who had given her shelter without demanding payment, who had somehow become the fixed point around which her new life revolved. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate but sincere. "You have already thanked me," he reminded her. "I know, but I feel it bears repeating. You gave me back my life when I thought it was over. You gave me a reason to believe I might be worth something after all. That is not a small thing." His hand found hers on the table, his fingers warm despite the cold that pressed against the windows. "You were always worth something," he said. "I simply made it impossible for you to ignore that fact." The feast continued late into the night, the hall filled with music and laughter and the kind of warmth that has nothing to do with fires. When finally the celebration wound down and the servants began to disperse, Lucien walked Isola to her room, as had become his custom. At her door, he paused, his hand still holding hers, his expression contemplative. "I want you to know," he said slowly, as if choosing each word with care, "that you have become important to me in ways I did not anticipate. When I claimed you at that altar, I acted on impulse, on a desire to correct an injustice. But in the time since, you have become more than a responsibility or a project. You have become someone I value, someone whose presence has reminded me why I chose to endure all these long years. I do not say this to pressure you or to make you uncomfortable. I say it only because it is true, and truth matters." Isola's heart hammered in her chest, her breath catching at the unexpected vulnerability in his confession. She had felt the bond growing between them, had sensed the shift from protector and protected to something more equal, more mutual. But hearing him speak it aloud made it real in a way it had not been before. "You have become important to me as well," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not know how to name it, did not want to presume. But when I think about leaving, about going somewhere else, the idea feels wrong in a way I cannot fully articulate. This place, your presence, has become home to me. You have become someone I trust, someone I want to know better, someone whose regard matters more than I expected anyone's regard ever could again." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the coolness that emanated from him, the otherness that marked him as something more than human. But she did not step back. Instead, she held her ground, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that surprised her. "May I kiss you?" he asked, the question formal but the desire behind it unmistakable. She answered by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his, a brief contact that sent electricity racing through her veins. His hand came up to cup her face, gentle despite the strength she knew he possessed. The kiss deepened slightly, then broke, leaving them both breathing harder than before. "Good night," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Good night," she echoed and slipped into her room before her courage could fail. She leaned against the closed door, her fingers touching her lips, her mind reeling. She had kissed him. She had wanted to kiss him. And from the way he had responded, he had wanted it too. The realization filled her with a combination of excitement and terror. The sense that she had just stepped off a cliff without knowing if she could fly. Sleep was impossible. She paced her room, sat by the window, lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts circled endlessly around that moment in the hallway, around the feel of his lips on hers, around the implications of what had just shifted between them. She had come to this place expecting nothing. Now she found herself wanting something, someone, in a way that felt both thrilling and dangerous. In the morning, she woke heavy-eyed but determined. She dressed carefully, took extra time with her hair, then made her way downstairs with her heart in her throat. She found Lucien in the conservatory, standing among the plants with his back to the door. He turned when he heard her enter, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. "I did not sleep," he said without preamble. "I spent the night thinking about you, about us, about what happens next." "And what did you conclude?" she asked, moving closer. "That I want more than I should," he admitted. "That I am older than you, can comprehend and should know better than to involve you in complications you did not ask for. But also that I cannot bring myself to regret what happened last night, and that I will not take it back, even if doing so would be wiser." She reached him, standing close enough to touch but not yet touching. "I do not want you to take it back," she said. "I do not care about your age or your complications. I care that you saw me when no one else did, that you chose me when everyone else rejected me, that you have made me feel alive again. That matters more than wisdom or caution, or any of the reasons we might invent to deny what is growing between us. He pulled her to him then, his arms encircling her with a careful strength that made her feel both fragile and safe. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other, feeling the reality of skin and warmth and breath. When they finally pulled apart, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears if he were capable of such things. "We will take this slowly," he said. "I will not rush you or push you beyond what you are ready for. But know that I am yours as much as you are mine, that what exists between us is not ownership but partnership, not possession but choice." "I know," she said, and realized it was true. The winter stretched on, but it no longer felt dark or confining. Isola spent her days learning the castle's secrets, her evenings in Lucien's company, her nights dreaming of futures that had seemed impossible mere months ago. They grew closer gradually, their relationship deepening through shared conversations and stolen kisses, through the slow building of trust that came from showing each other their vulnerable places and finding acceptance there. Spring arrived eventually, bringing with it new growth and new possibilities. The snow melted, revealing gardens that burst into bloom with almost shocking speed. Isola walked among the flowers with Lucien beside her, their hands linked, their steps matched. They talked of small things and large ones, of plans for the coming months and dreams for the years beyond. "I never imagined my life could become this," she confessed one afternoon as they sat beneath a flowering tree, its petals drifting down around them like snow. "I thought my story was written, that the best I could hope for was survival. But now I find myself hoping for so much more." "Hope is dangerous," Lucien said, but there was no darkness in his tone. "It makes us vulnerable in ways that nothing else can. But it also makes us human, or as close to human as some of us can get. I had forgotten how to hope until you reminded me." "Then we are even," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You gave me a reason to live. I gave you a reason to hope. That seems like a fair exchange." He laughed, a sound she had heard only rarely but treasured when it came. "More than fair," he agreed. "More than I deserved, certainly." "You deserve more than you think you do," she told him. "You have carried the weight of centuries alone. Perhaps it is time to share that burden with someone who wants to help carry it." "Perhaps it is," he murmured, and kissed the top of her head with a tenderness that made her heart ache in the best possible way. As spring gave way to summer, the castle filled with life. Birds nested in the eaves, flowers bloomed in riotous profusion, and visitors came and went with increasing frequency. Isola took on more responsibilities, helping to manage the household, greeting guests, offering counsel when asked. She discovered she had a gift for diplomacy, for seeing the heart of conflicts and suggesting solutions that satisfied all parties. Lucien watched her grow into this role with visible pride, supporting her decisions and deferring to her judgment on matters she understood better than he did. One evening, as they stood together on the battlements watching the sun set over the forest, he told her something he had told no one else in centuries. "I was mortal once," he said quietly. "I had a family, a life that seemed full and complete. Then I was offered a choice, die with them or accept transformation and live on. I chose life, and I have regretted that choice and celebrated it in equal measure ever since. But meeting you has tipped the balance. For the first time in longer than I can express, I am glad I survived. Because if I had not, I would never have known you." Isola felt tears prick her eyes, felt the weight of his confession settle over her like a blessing. "I am glad you survived too," she whispered. "I am glad we found each other, even in such strange circumstances. I am glad that my worst moment became the doorway to my best life." They stood together as darkness fell, watching stars emerge one by one, each point of light a promise of continuity. Behind them, the castle glowed with warmth and life. Below them, the world stretched out vast and complicated and full of possibility. And between them, something that had started as rescue had transformed into partnership, into love, into a bond that felt strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. In the village below, People still told stories about the Duke and his mysterious bride, about the woman who was abandoned at the altar and claimed by shadows. Some versions painted her as victim, others as villain, most as some combination of both. But Isola no longer cared what stories others told. She was writing her own now, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of courage or tenderness or hope at a time. And as she stood beside Lucienne under the emerging stars, she understood that this was not an ending but a beginning, that the rejection that had seemed to destroy her had actually freed her to become someone she had never imagined she could be. The girl who had stood trembling at that altar was gone, transformed into a woman who knew her own strength, who had learned to claim space as if she had every right to it, who had discovered that being chosen was indeed different from being owned. She had been broken and made whole. She had been rejected and accepted. She had been lost and found. And in the finding, she had discovered not just safety but joy, not just survival but life, not just a refuge but a home. The moon rose full and bright, casting silver light across the castle walls. Music drifted up from the hall below where the servants were celebrating some small occasion. The air smelled of roses and pine and the promise of rain. And in that moment, standing beside the man who had claimed her and the life she had claimed for herself, Isola felt something she had never expected to feel: complete. Not because someone else completed her, but because she had learned to complete herself. Not because she had been rescued, but because she had learned to be her own hero. Not because her story had reached its ending, but because she had finally understood that every ending was also a beginning, and that the most important stories were the ones we wrote for ourselves. The night deepened around them, but neither moved to go inside. They remained on the battlements, two figures silhouetted against the stars, holding each other as the world turned beneath them. And if anyone had asked Isola in that moment whether she regretted the rejection that had brought her here, she would have answered with absolute certainty, no, because sometimes the worst thing that ever happened to us becomes the best thing that could have happened. If only we are brave enough to walk through the door, it opens. And she had been brave. Not at first, perhaps, but gradually, learning courage the way one learns any language, through practice and repetition and the willingness to make mistakes. She had been brave enough to take his hand, brave enough to stay when leaving would have been easier, brave enough to open her heart again after it had been shattered, brave enough to believe that she deserved good things, deserved happiness, deserved love. That bravery had been rewarded with everything she had never known to want. And as the moon climbed higher and the stars wheeled overhead, she made a silent promise to herself. She would never forget how far she had come, would never take for granted the life she had built, would never stop fighting for the happiness she had found in this strange and wonderful place. Lucien's arm tightened around her, as if he could sense her thoughts. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. "That I am grateful," she replied. "That I am happy. That I am exactly where I am supposed to be." "As am I," he said. And in those simple words she heard everything he could not say, everything that lived between them in the spaces where language failed. They remained there until the night grew cold and the celebrations below had quieted. Then, hand in hand, they descended from the battlements and returned to the warmth of the castle, to the life they were building together, to the future that stretched before them like an open road. And though neither spoke of it, both knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Two souls who had found each other in darkness and chosen to create light. The story could have ended there, with that perfect moment of understanding and connection. But life is not made of perfect moments alone. It is made also of the ordinary ones, the small daily choices and gestures that accumulate into something larger than themselves. And so their story continued, not as a fairy tale with a neat conclusion, but as a life lived fully and consciously, with all its joys and challenges and unexpected turns. The summer brought with it a heat that felt almost foreign to the northerner, lands transforming the castle grounds into something lush and wild. Isola discovered parts of the estate she had not known existed, a walled garden where herbs grew in ordered rows, a reflecting pool that mirrored the sky so perfectly it seemed to hold its own weather. A grove of ancient trees whose trunks were wider than her outstretched arms could encompass. She walked these spaces with increasing confidence, no longer a guest or a refugee, but someone who belonged, who had earned her place through the simple act of choosing to stay. Lucien watched her transformation with something that looked like wonder. She caught him sometimes, his gaze following her as she moved through rooms or crossed courtyards, and in those moments she saw not the remote lord of shadows, but someone capable of softness, of vulnerability, of the kind of affection that required no words to communicate itself. They had fallen into patterns of intimacy that felt both natural and profound. Morning walks through the gardens, afternoons spent reading in companionable silence, evenings where conversation flowed as freely as the wine they shared. Touch had become easier between them, less fraught with hesitation. A hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing in passing, the press of lips against forehead or cheek or mouth, all of it building toward something neither had named but both recognized. One morning, Isola woke to find a letter had been slipped under her door. The handwriting was elegant, the paper thick and expensive. She opened it carefully, her heart beating faster as she recognized the royal seal pressed into the wax. The contents were brief but significant. She was invited to court, to be formally presented as the lady of the Northern Estate, to take her place among the nobility that had once witnessed her humiliation. The invitation came with assurances of safety and respect, with promises that past grievances had been forgotten, with the king's own guarantee that she would be received with honor. She found Lucien in his study, the letter clutched in her hand. He looked up when she entered, his expression shifting from concentration to concern as he registered her agitation. "The king has invited me to court," she said without preamble. "He wants to formally recognize my position here." Lucien set down his pen, giving her his full attention. "And how do you feel about that?" "Terrified," she admitted, sinking into the chair across from his desk. "The last time I was among those people, I was being rejected and humiliated. The thought of facing them again, of being scrutinized and judged, makes me want to refuse outright. But I also know that hiding here forever is not an option. If I am to truly claim this life, I need to show them that I am not ashamed, that I have not been broken by what happened." "You do not need to prove anything to anyone," Lucien said gently. "Those people do not deserve the effort of your concern. Their opinions are worth less than dust." "Perhaps," she agreed, "but their opinions shape the world beyond these walls. If I am to be your partner, to stand beside you in truth, then I need to be able to navigate that world without fear. I need to show them that I am more than the girl who was abandoned. I need to show myself that I am more than that." He studied her for a long moment, his grey eyes searching her face. Then he nodded slowly. "If you wish to go, I will accompany you. You will not face them alone." Relief flooded through her, loosening the tension that had coiled in her chest. "Thank you. I think I need to do this, as much as I dread it. But knowing you will be there makes it feel possible." The preparations for the journey took several weeks. Dresses were commissioned, jewelry selected, travel arrangements made. Isola threw herself into the details, using them to distract from her mounting anxiety. She practiced walking with the regal bearing expected of nobility, rehearsed conversations. In her mind, tried to imagine herself in those glittering halls without feeling the phantom weight of her wedding veil, the ghost of her abandonment. Lucien was patient with her fears, never dismissing them but also never allowing them to overwhelm her. He told her stories of court life, warned her of the pitfalls and games, taught her how to read the subtle cues that separated genuine interest from manipulation. He reminded her that she had survived worse than awkward conversations and veiled insults, that the strength she had demonstrated in choosing to rebuild her life was worth more than all the practiced charm of courtiers combined. The night before their departure, Isola found herself unable to sleep. She rose from her bed and wrapped herself in a robe, then made her way through the dark corridors to the library, seeking the comfort of familiar surroundings. She found Lucien there, as she had half expected, seated by the fire with a book open, on his lap, but his eyes focused on the flames rather than the pages. "I thought I might find you here," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He looked up, a slight smile touching his lips. "And I am not surprised to see you. We are both creatures of habit when anxious, it seems." She settled into the chair beside his, pulling her feet up beneath her and wrapping the robe more tightly around herself. The fire cast dancing shadows across the walls, making the room feel smaller and more intimate than it did in daylight. For a while, neither spoke, the silence comfortable and undemanding. "I keep thinking about that day," Isola finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Standing at the altar, feeling the weight of all those eyes, hearing Edric say he could not go through with it. "I remember the exact texture of my humiliation, the way it felt like my skin had been stripped away and I was standing there raw and exposed for everyone to see. And now I am choosing to return to that place, to face those people again. Part of me wonders if I have lost my mind." "You have not lost your mind," Lucien assured her. "You are confronting your past so that it no longer has power over your future. That is not madness. That is courage of the highest order." "It does not feel courageous," she confessed. "It feels foolish and painful, and like I am deliberately walking into a storm when I could stay here where it is safe." "Courage rarely feels the way we expect it to," he said. "It feels like fear that we walk through anyway. It feels like choosing discomfort because the alternative is worse. You could stay here, yes. You could hide from those people for the rest of your life. But you would always carry that day with you as an unhealed wound, always wonder what they thought of you, always feel diminished by their judgment. By going back, by showing them who you have become, you take back the power they held over you. You rewrite the ending of that story." She reached out and took his hand, needing the solid reality of his touch to anchor her. "Will you tell me something true?" she asked. "Always," he promised. "Are you afraid of anything? In all your long life, with all your power, is there anything that still frightens you?" He was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "I am afraid of losing what I have found with you," he said finally. "I am afraid that the passage of time, which has been my companion for so long, will eventually take you from me as it takes all mortal things. I am afraid that I will forget how to feel this way, that your presence will become so familiar, I will stop treasuring it, stop recognizing the gift that it is. And I am afraid that my nature, the darkness that is part of what I am, will somehow taint the light I see in you." Isola felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty in his words. "You could never taint me," she said fiercely. "You saved me. You saw value in me when I had none to give. You taught me that I was worth more than I believed. How could that be anything but light?" "Because light can blind as surely as darkness can hide," he replied. "Because the pedestal I have placed you on is high, and falls from such heights can be devastating. Because I am selfish enough to want to keep you here, safe and protected, even though I know that true love means allowing freedom, even when that freedom leads to risk." She rose from her chair and moved to kneel beside his, taking both his hands in hers and looking up into his face. In the firelight, his features were softened, made more human, though she knew that humanity was only a mask over something far older and stranger. "I do not want to be on a pedestal," she told him. "I want to be beside you, equal and real, with all my flaws visible. I want you to see me as I am, not as some idealized version that exists only in your imagination. And I want the same from you. Show me your darkness. Trust that I am strong enough to bear it." He pulled her up then, drawing her into his lap, cradling her against his chest as if she was something precious and breakable. "You are stronger than you know," he murmured into her hair. "Stronger than I am in many ways. You face your fears head on, while I have spent centuries avoiding mine. You embrace vulnerability while I have armored myself in power and distance. You are teaching me how to be human again, and that is both the most terrifying and most wonderful gift anyone has ever given me." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other and in the warm glow of the fire, until the logs burned down to embers and the darkness outside began to soften toward dawn. When they finally rose to return to their rooms, Isola felt steadier, fortified by his honesty and by her own ability to offer comfort. Tomorrow they would begin the journey to court. Tomorrow she would face the ghosts of her past. But tonight, in this moment, she was exactly where she needed to be. The journey itself took 3 days. The carriage rolling through changing landscapes as they moved from the wild northern territories toward the more cultivated lands surrounding the capital. Isola watched through the windows as forests gave way to farms, as small villages became larger towns, as the evidence of human settlement grew denser and more complex. With each mile, she felt the protective isolation of the castle falling away, replaced by a mounting awareness of the world she was about to re-enter. Lucian sat across from her, reading or watching the scenery or occasionally engaging her in conversation designed to distract from her anxiety. He pointed out landmarks, told stories about the places they passed, made dry observations about the state of the roads and the architecture that made her laugh despite her nerves. At night, they stayed in inns where his arrival caused the staff to trip over themselves in their eagerness to please, where rooms were cleared and meals prepared with frantic speed. Isola watched how he handled this attention with a combination of courtesy and detachment. Never cruel, but never warm either, maintaining a distance that kept people from presuming familiarity. On the third evening, they crested a hill and the capital came into view, sprawling across the valley below like a living thing of stone and smoke and glittering windows. Isola's breath caught at the sight of it, at the sheer scale and complexity, at the reminder of how small she was in comparison to this vast accumulation of human ambition and activity. Somewhere in that maze of streets and buildings was the chapel where she had been abandoned. Somewhere down there were people who remembered her humiliation, who had witnessed her at her lowest and most vulnerable. "We do not have to do this," Lucienne said quietly, reading her expression. "We can turn around right now, return to the castle, send a polite refusal to the king. No one would blame you." She shook her head, forcing steel into her spine. "No, I need to do this. I need to prove to myself that I can." They arrived at the palace as twilight was settling over the city, the sky painted in shades of purple and gold. Guards snapped to attention as their carriage passed through the gates. Servants materialized to handle their luggage, to escort them through corridors that seemed designed to overwhelm with their opulence. Isola kept her chin high, her posture straight, her expression carefully neutral, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The rooms they were given overlooked the palace gardens, spacious and luxuriously appointed, with connecting doors that could be left open or closed depending on their preference. Isola stood at the window and looked out at the manicured landscape below, so different from the wild beauty of the castle grounds. Everything here was controlled, shaped, made to serve human aesthetic rather than allowed to exist on its own terms. It felt suffocating in a way she had not anticipated, this evidence of humanity's need to dominate and order every aspect of existence. "The presentation is tomorrow evening," Lucienne said from behind her. "We will have time to rest, to prepare. The king has arranged a private audience before the formal reception, so you will not be thrown immediately into the crowd." "That was kind of him," Isola murmured, still watching the gardens. "He is a practical man," Lucienne replied. "He knows that having me as an ally is worth the effort of ensuring you are comfortable. Politics dressed up as courtesy, though I suspect there is genuine goodwill beneath it as well. He is not a cruel man, merely a calculating one." She turned to face him, finding him closer than she had expected. "Will you stay with me?" she asked, hating the tremor of vulnerability in her voice. "During the audience, during the reception?" I know I need to be able to stand on my own, but I do not think I can do this without knowing you are there. I will not leave your side unless you ask me to, he promised. You are not alone in this, Isola. You are never alone. The words settled over her like a blanket, warm and reassuring. She stepped into his embrace, letting him hold her as the last light faded from the sky and the palace began to glow with lamplight and candle flame. Tomorrow would bring challenges, confrontations, tests of her newfound strength. But tonight she could rest in the knowledge that whatever came, she would face it with someone who believed in her, who saw her value, who had chosen her when no one else would. Morning arrived too quickly, bringing with it a flurry of activity as servants came to help her dress, to arrange her hair, to apply subtle cosmetics that enhanced without concealing. Isola submitted to their ministrations numbly, watching in the mirror as they transformed her into someone who looked regal and composed, someone who bore little resemblance to the terrified girl in the wedding dress. The gown they had chosen was midnight blue, elegant without being ostentatious, its cut flattering and its fabric rich. Jewelry that had belonged to Lucienne's family adorned her throat and wrists, pieces that spoke of old wealth and older power. When she was finally ready, she barely recognized herself. The woman in the mirror looked confident, poised, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with presence. She stood straighter, held her head higher, met her own gaze without flinching. This was who she had become. This was the person she had fought to be. Lucienne was waiting when she emerged, dressed in formal black that made him look even more dangerous and compelling than usual. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her, and the appreciation in his expression sent warmth flooding through her. "You are magnificent," he said simply. "I am terrified," she corrected, but she smiled as she said it. "You can be both," he assured her, offering his arm. In fact, the combination is rather formidable. The private audience with the king took place in a chamber designed for intimacy rather than ceremony, its furnishings comfortable and its atmosphere deliberately informal. The king himself was younger than Isola had expected, perhaps 40, with intelligent eyes and the kind of face that revealed little of what he was thinking. He rose when they entered, greeting Lucienne with the respect of equals and turning to Isola with an expression that seemed genuinely welcoming. "Lady Isola," he said, taking her hand and bowing over it. "I am pleased to finally meet you properly. I hope your journey was comfortable and that your accommodations are satisfactory." "They are more than satisfactory, Your Majesty," she replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "You have been most generous." "It is the least I could do," he said, gesturing for them to sit. "I must confess, when I first heard of the circumstances that brought you to the Duke's protection, I was uncertain how to respond. The situation was unprecedented, the breach of contract and customs severe. But upon reflection, and after consulting with my advisors, I came to believe that sometimes justice requires setting aside convention in favor of what is right. You were wronged, Lady Isola. What happened to you at that altar was a cruelty that should never have been allowed. I am sorry that you suffered such humiliation under the eyes of my court." The apology stunned her into momentary silence. She had not expected this, had not imagined that someone with such power would acknowledge her pain, would validate her experience. Tears pricked her eyes and she blinked them back furiously, determined not to cry in front of this man. "Thank you," she managed. "Your words mean more than you might know." "I hope they do," he said gently. "Because what I am about to ask of you requires courage of a sort that few possess. Tonight, at the reception, you will be presented to the same court that witnessed your rejection. Many of those people will be curious, some will be judgmental, and a few will be cruel. I cannot control their private thoughts or their whispered words, but I can make it clear that you have my protection and my respect, that you are to be treated with the dignity befitting your position. Will you allow me to do that? Will you stand before them and show them that you have not only survived but thrived?" Isola glanced at Lucienne, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. Then she turned back to the king, drawing on every ounce of strength she possessed. "I will," she said. "I will stand before them, and I will show them exactly who I have become." The king smiled, and there was something like approval in his expression. "I thought you might say that. You have more courage than most of the nobles who will be there tonight. They hide behind titles and wealth and the accident of their birth. You stand on nothing but your own merit, and that makes you more formidable than they will ever be." The conversation continued for another hour, ranging over topics both serious and light. The king asked about life in the Northern Territories, about the castle and its management, about her adjustment to her new position. He spoke of his own challenges in governing a realm that seemed to grow more complex with each passing year. He told stories that made her laugh and shared observations that made her think. By the time they took their leave, Isola felt something like fondness for this man who wore his crown with a combination of duty and weariness. "He likes you," Lucien observed as they walked back to their rooms. "That is rare. He is not easily impressed." "He is not what I expected," Isola admitted. "I thought royalty would be more distant, more concerned with their own importance. He seemed almost human." "Perhaps that is why he has held power as long as he has," Lucien suggested. "He remembers that crowns do not make people more than human, only more responsible." The hours before the reception passed in a blur of final preparations and mounting anxiety. Isola tried to eat but found she had no appetite. She tried to rest but could not quiet her racing thoughts. She paced her room, rehearsed what she might say if confronted, imagined scenarios both terrible and triumphant. Through it all, Lucien remained a steady presence, never pushing but always available, offering distraction or silence depending on what she seemed to need. Finally, as evening fell and the time came to descend to the grand ballroom, Isola took a final look at herself in the mirror. She saw fear in her eyes but also determination. She saw the girl she had been, but also the woman she had become. She saw vulnerability and strength existing together, neither cancelling out the other, both making her complete. "I am ready," she told Lucien, and was surprised to find it was true. The ballroom was everything she remembered and worse. Vast and glittering and filled with people who turned to stare as she and Lucien were announced. Conversations stuttered and died. The music continued but seemed to grow quieter. Every eye in the room found them, and Isola felt the weight of that collective attention like a physical force. Her instinct was to shrink back, to hide behind Lucien, to flee back to the safety of their rooms. But she fought that instinct with everything she had, keeping her chin high and her expressions serene as they descended the stairs into the crowd. She saw familiar faces, women who had whispered about her, men who had looked away rather than defend her, the priest who had presided over her abandoned wedding. She saw Edric near the back of the room, pale and diminished, unable to meet her eyes. She saw the nobles who had come to the castle demanding explanations, now subdued and careful in their observation. And she saw others too, people she did not recognize but who clearly knew who she was, whose curiosity was written plainly on their faces. The king appeared at her elbow, offering his arm in a gesture that made his support unmistakable. "Shall we?" he asked, his voice pitched low enough that only she and Lucien could hear. She took his arm, and together they moved through the crowd. People bowed as they passed, murmured greetings that she returned with gracious nods. The king introduced her to various nobles and dignitaries, each interaction brief but significant. She answered their questions, accepted their compliments, deflected their probing inquiries with a skill she had not known she possessed. Lucien remained at her side, a silent but powerful presence that reminded everyone that she was not without protection, not without power of her own. As the evening progressed, Isola felt herself relaxing incrementally. Yes, people stared. Yes, there were whispers and speculation. But she was handling it, was proving to herself and to them that she could navigate this world without breaking. She was not the helpless girl they remembered. She was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had learned that survival was its own form of victory. Near midnight, as the crowd had thinned somewhat and the music had shifted to slower, more intimate melodies, Lucien drew her onto the dance floor. She moved into his arms as naturally as breathing, letting him lead her through steps she had learned in preparation for a wedding that never happened. But this was different. This was not obligation or duty or the performance of a role. This was choice freely made, with someone who valued her and saw her and wanted nothing from her but her presence. "You are doing beautifully," he murmured as they turned across the floor. "I am surviving," she corrected. "There is a difference." "Not as much as you think," he said. "Surviving with grace is its own form of beauty. You are showing them who you are, and they cannot help but be impressed." She glanced around the ballroom, seeing the faces that watched them with expressions ranging from admiration to envy to lingering disapproval. "Some of them still judge me," she observed. "Of course they do," Lucienne agreed. "They will always find reasons to judge because judgment makes them feel superior. But their judgment has no power unless you give it power. You have learned that lesson already. Now you are simply practicing it on a larger stage." The dance ended, and they made their way to one of the balconies that overlooked the palace gardens. The night air was cool and welcome after the stuffy heat of the ballroom. Isola leaned against the balustrade, letting the breeze cool her flushed skin, feeling exhaustion beginning to seep through the adrenaline that had sustained her. "I did it," she said wonderingly. "I actually did it." "You did," Lucienne confirmed, moving to stand beside her. "And you will do it again tomorrow and the day after and every day that requires courage. Because that is who you are now, someone who faces her fears rather than hiding from them." She turned to him, seeing in the moonlight the face she had come to know so well, the eyes that saw her more clearly than she often saw herself. "I could not have done this without you," she said softly. "You know that, do not you? You gave me the foundation I needed to rebuild myself. You believed in me when I had no reason to believe in myself." "I simply saw what was already there," he replied. "The strength, the resilience, the capacity for growth. I did not create those things. I merely provided an environment where they could flourish." "Then let me thank you anyway," she said, rising on her toes to kiss him. There on the balcony with the ballroom glowing behind them and the gardens spreading dark and mysterious below. The kiss was gentle but sure, a reaffirmation of what had grown between them, of the partnership they had built from broken pieces and stubborn hope. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his and breathed in the familiar scent of him. Pine and cold stone and something indefinable that was simply Lucienne. "I think I am ready to go home now," she whispered. "Then home we shall go," he promised, "as soon as duty allows." They remained at court for 3 more days, attending functions and meeting with various nobles and representatives. Each day grew easier than the last, each interaction less fraught with anxiety. Isola discovered that she had a talent for reading people, for understanding what they wanted and how to navigate their expectations without compromising herself. She made allies among the more progressive nobles, women who admired her strength and men who respected her intelligence. She deflected the attempts of those who sought to use her as a weapon against Lucienne or the king, and she faced down the few who dared to reference her abandoned wedding with a calm dignity that made them look small and petty by comparison. On their final evening at the palace, the king hosted a private dinner in their honor. It was a small gathering, intimate and informal, with only a handful of the most trusted advisors present. Over the course of the meal, Isola found herself truly relaxed for the first time since their arrival, laughing at stories and contributing her own observations, feeling like she belonged in this company of powerful and intelligent people. As dessert was being served, the king raised his glass in a toast. "To Lady Isola," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet room, "who has reminded us all that true nobility has nothing to do with birth and everything to do with character. May her example inspire us to be better than we are, to see value where we might otherwise look past it, to recognize that how we treat those with less power than ourselves defines us far more than any title or fortune ever could." The words settled over the table like a benediction. Isola felt tears prick her eyes again, felt the weight of recognition and acceptance and something close to redemption. She raised her own glass, her hand steady despite the emotion churning through her. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said, "for your wisdom, your kindness, and for giving me the opportunity to prove that second chances are worth granting." They drank, and the conversation moved on to other topics. But Isola carried the king's words with her through the rest of the evening, a gift more valuable than any jewel or title. Someone she respected saw her as more than her past, more than her circumstances, more than the sum of what had been done to her. He saw her as she had fought so hard to become, a woman of substance and strength, worthy of respect and recognition. The journey back to the castle felt different than the journey away from it. Isola watched the landscape change with a sense of homecoming rather than escape, eager now to return to the place that had become her sanctuary and her foundation. She had faced her fears and survived. She had stood before those who had witnessed her humiliation and shown them that she had risen above it. She had claimed her place in a world that had tried to discard her. And now she was going home, back to the wild northern territories, back to the castle with its ancient stones and flowering gardens, back to the life she had built with someone who valued her completely. The girl who had stood trembling at that altar would not recognize the woman she had become. And that, Isola thought, as the carriage rolled through familiar forests, was exactly as it should be. Growth required leaving behind the person you were, even as you carried the lessons of that person with you. She had been broken and had learned to build herself stronger in the broken places. She had been rejected and had learned that rejection was sometimes redirection towards something better. She had been abandoned and had learned that the most important person to never abandon was yourself. When the castle finally came into view, rising from the hills with its towers reaching toward a cloud-scattered sky, Isola felt something in her chest loosen and expand. This was home. Not because it was safe or familiar, though it was both those things, but because it was the place where she had learned to be herself without apology, without shame, without the constant fear that had shaped so much of her early life. It was the place where she had been seen and chosen and valued. It was the place where she had fallen in love, not just with Lucienne, but with the possibility of her own life, with the future that stretched before her full of potential and promise. The servants lined up to welcome them home, their faces reflecting genuine pleasure at their return. The silver-haired housekeeper who had first shown Isola to her room actually smiled, a rare expression that transformed her severe features. Even the usually stoic steward seemed pleased, bowing deeply and murmuring something about how quiet the castle had been in their absence. Isola moved through the familiar corridors with a sense of rightness. Touching walls she knew, breathing air that smelled of home. She found herself in the conservatory without consciously choosing to go there, drawn by habit and affection to the place where so many important conversations had occurred. The plants seemed to have thrived in her absence, their leaves glossy and full, their blooms more abundant than ever. She walked among them slowly, reacquainting herself with their varied textures and scents. Lucienne found her there as the afternoon light slanted through the glass, painting everything in shades of gold and green. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her, and when she turned to him, the expression on his face made her breath catch. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You are beautiful," he said simply. "But more than that, you are at peace. I can see it in the way you move, the way you hold yourself. Something shifted during our time at court. You claimed your power fully, and now you carry it like you were born to it." She crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. "I claimed what you helped me find," she corrected. "You showed me I was worth more than I believed. Everything else grew from that foundation." "We helped each other," he said. "You reminded me why I chose to endure these long years. You gave me purpose beyond mere survival. You taught me that power without connection is just another form of death." She pulled him further into the conservatory, into the heart of the green growing things, into the space that had witnessed so many of their conversations. "I love you," she said, the words emerging naturally without calculation or fear. "I think I have loved you for a while now, but I was afraid to say it. Afraid it would change things or complicate them or make me vulnerable in ways I was not ready for. But I am ready now. I love you, Lucienne. And I want you to know that, regardless of what comes next." His hands came up to frame her face, his touch gentle despite the strength she knew he possessed. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I thought I could still love anything. More than I have loved anyone in centuries. You have become essential to me in ways I cannot fully articulate. The thought of a future without you in it is unbearable. And yet I know that your mortality is a certainty I will have to face someday. That knowledge is both precious and terrible. Then let us not waste the time we have," she said fiercely. Let us fill our days with as much life and love and meaning as we can hold. Let us build something together that will outlast even time's hunger. Memory, legacy, the kind of love that changes people who witness it. That is what I want to create with you." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, a kiss that spoke of promise and passion and the kind of devotion that required no words. Around them, the plants seemed to lean closer, as if blessing this moment, as if recognizing something sacred in the joining of two souls who had found each other against all odds. The light shifted and changed, painting them in amber and gold, freezing the moment in memory where it would live forever. Perfect and complete. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and slightly dazed, Lucian rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said quietly. "Not for show or politics or because convention demands it, but because I want to bind my life to yours in every way possible. I want to stand before witnesses and claim you again, not as the Duke claiming property, but as a man choosing a partner. I want everyone to know that you are mine and I am yours, that we have chosen each other freely and completely." Isola felt joy bubble up through her chest, effervescent and overwhelming. "Yes," she said, laughing through sudden tears. "Yes, I will marry you. I will stand beside you and claim you just as you claim me. I will build a life with you that honors both our pasts and creates a future worth living." They stood together in the conservatory as evening fell, wrapped in each other and in the certainty of their choice. Outside, the world continued its endless turning. But here, in this moment, in this place they had both fought so hard to create, time seemed to pause, to acknowledge something rare and precious. Two people who had been broken in different ways, who had found each other in darkness, who had chosen to create light together. It was not a fairy tale ending because it was not an ending at all. It was a beginning, the start of something that would grow and change and require constant tending. But that was the nature of love that lasted. It was not static or simple or easy. It was work and compromise and the daily choice to show up for each other even when it was hard. But they had both learned how to do hard things. They had both survived impossibilities. And now they would build something impossible together. A partnership that transcended the boundaries of mortality and power, that created space for vulnerability and strength that honored both shadow and light. The castle would witness it. The servants would celebrate it. The world beyond would judge or admire or misunderstand it. But none of that mattered as much as the simple truth that they had found each other, chosen each other, and would continue choosing each other for as long as time allowed. If this story found a reflection in you, leave a comment and share it. Sometimes the quietest pain is the most human.